In the misty hills of 19th century Switzerland, a man walked who would forever change how humanity understands the depths of its own mind. Carl Jung was not just a psychiatrist, he was an explorer of the unconscious, a cartographer of the soul, a bridge builder between science and spirituality, who anticipated the greatest psychological discoveries of the modern age. Long before neuroscience mapped the brain's neural networks, Jung had charted the archetypal patterns that govern human behavior. Decades before cognitive psychology emerged, Jung had identified the complex psychological mechanisms that shape our personalities. Years before spiritual psychology became accepted, Jung had demonstrated the fundamental connection between mental health and meaning-making. What you're about to hear is every major psychological insight that this pioneering genius ever developed. If you're finding value in these explorations, I genuinely appreciate a quick like or subscribe. It truly makes a difference. I'm always fascinated to know where you're tuning in from, so leave a comment sharing your city and what time you're listening. It's amazing to see our worldwide community connecting through these deep dives into the human mind. Now, settle in comfortably, maybe adjust your lighting for that perfect ambience, and let's embark on tonight's psychological journey together. We're going to discover why your dreams matter more than you think, why your personality isn't what you believe it is, and why the deepest parts of yourself remain hidden even from you. This is not mere psychology we are discussing. These theories and discoveries contain the most profound insights into human consciousness ever developed. They explore the deepest questions that have fascinated humanity since self-awareness began. Why do we dream? What shapes our personalities? How can we become whole individuals? What is the relationship between mind and meaning? Can human beings achieve psychological integration? What lies in the unconscious depths? And how can we explain the universal patterns that appear across all cultures and throughout history? Jung did not approach these questions as a detached academic sitting in a laboratory. He lived through some of the most intense psychological experiences imaginable. As a child, he experienced vivid visions and dreams that most would dismiss as mere fantasy. He suffered a profound psychological breakdown in midlife that nearly destroyed his career but ultimately became the foundation of his greatest insights. He explored his own unconscious through dangerous psychological experiments that pushed him to the brink of madness. He witnessed the collective psychological breakdown of an entire civilization during 2 world wars. He knew the depths of the human psyche intimately, both its creative potential and its destructive shadows. This gave his psychological insights a depth and authenticity that purely theoretical psychologists could never achieve. But Jung was also a man of extraordinary intellectual breadth and learning. He studied medicine, philosophy, theology, anthropology, and mythology. He engaged with the greatest thinkers of his time and understood the intellectual currents shaping modern consciousness. He saw where psychology was heading and recognized both its tremendous potential and its dangerous limitations. He witnessed the rise of behaviorism, reductionist materialism, and mechanistic approaches to the human mind, and he understood that these seemingly scientific approaches missed the essential mystery and meaning that make us human. He dedicated his life to developing a psychology that could honor both the scientific method and the profound spiritual dimensions of human experience. The psychology you are about to explore is not a rigid academic system. It is a living, breathing exploration of consciousness itself. It emerges through careful observation of patients who felt as real and complex as anyone you've ever known. It is grounded in decades of clinical work with people struggling to find meaning and wholeness. It is a psychology born from personal crisis, refined through scientific rigor, and offered as a guide to anyone seeking to understand the full depths of human consciousness. Prepare yourself for a journey into the mind of one of the most important thinkers who ever lived. Part 1. The Architecture of the Psyche. For Jung, the human psyche was not a simple entity that could be reduced to basic drives or learned behaviors. It was a vast, complex system with multiple layers, autonomous components, and dynamic relationships that operated according to their own inherent laws. Understanding this architecture was essential for grasping how consciousness develops, how personalities form, and why human beings behave in such seemingly contradictory and mysterious ways. Jung's model of the psyche began with what he called consciousness, the small portion of mental life that we are directly aware of at any given moment. This includes our immediate thoughts, feelings, perceptions, and memories that we can access voluntarily. But consciousness, Jung realized, was merely the tip of an enormous iceberg. Beneath it lay vast territories of mental activity that operated outside our direct awareness but profoundly influenced every aspect of our behavior and experience. The first layer beneath consciousness was what Jung termed the personal unconscious. This contained all the mental contents that had once been conscious but had been forgotten, repressed, or simply pushed below the threshold of awareness. Personal memories, traumatic experiences, unacceptable impulses, creative insights not yet ready for expression, all of this material continued to exist in the personal unconscious, influencing conscious behavior in ways that most people never suspected. But Jung's most revolutionary insight was his discovery of what he called the collective unconscious, a deeper layer of the psyche that contained universal patterns and images shared by all humanity. Unlike the personal unconscious, which was unique to each individual, the collective unconscious was inherited psychological material that connected every human being to the accumulated wisdom and experience of the entire species. Within this collective unconscious resided what Jung called archetypes, universal patterns of human experience that manifested across all cultures and throughout history. The mother archetype appeared in every society's mythology and religious imagery. The hero archetype drove countless stories of individuals overcoming impossible odds. The wise old man archetype provided guidance and wisdom in folklore worldwide. The shadow archetype represented the dark, rejected aspects of human nature that every culture struggled to integrate. These archetypes were not learned through education or cultural transmission. They were built into the very structure of human consciousness itself, emerging spontaneously in dreams, myths, religious visions, and creative works, regardless of cultural background or historical period. They represented the deepest patterns of human psychological experience, the fundamental ways that consciousness organized itself in response to universal life challenges. Understanding archetypes was crucial for understanding individual psychology because they provided the basic templates around which personality developed. Every person's individual psychology was shaped by their unique relationship to these universal patterns. Some people identified strongly with the hero archetype and spent their lives seeking challenges to overcome. Others resonated with the caregiver archetype and found meaning through nurturing others. Still others were driven by the creator archetype and felt compelled to bring new forms of beauty or truth into existence. But Jung recognized that this archetypal influence often operated unconsciously, creating internal conflicts and behavioral patterns that people could not understand through rational analysis alone. A person might consciously value independence and self-reliance while being unconsciously driven by the child archetype's need for protection and security. Another might publicly embrace traditional values while being secretly possessed by the rebel archetype's urge to overthrow established order. Jung's concept of psychological complexes explained how these unconscious dynamics created autonomous sub-personalities within individuals. A complex formed when archetypal energy became attached to specific personal experiences, creating semi-independent psychological entities that could take over consciousness under certain conditions. The mother complex might cause someone to seek maternal approval in all relationships, even when consciously they valued independence. The father complex might drive someone to either rebel against or submit to authority figures in ways that seemed irrational to outside observers. These complexes were not pathological in themselves, they were normal features of psychological development, but when they remained unconscious and unintegrated, they could dominate behavior in destructive ways. A person possessed by a complex was no longer freely choosing their responses, but was being driven by unconscious patterns they did not understand or control. The ego in Jung's system was the center of conscious identity, the I that thinks, feels, decides, and acts. But the ego was not the totality of personality, merely its conscious representative. It developed through interaction between innate archetypal patterns and specific life experiences, gradually forming a coherent sense of self that could navigate social reality and make conscious choices. However, Jung understood that the ego's view of itself was necessarily limited and often distorted. It could only access a fraction of total psychological content, and it had strong incentives to maintain a positive self-image, even at the cost of ignoring uncomfortable truths. This led to what Jung called the persona, the social mask that people developed to meet external expectations and hide aspects of themselves they found unacceptable. The persona was not false or artificial. It served important social functions and allowed people to play necessary roles in family, work, and community contexts. But problems arose when people became identified with their persona and lost touch with their deeper, more authentic self. They might become so focused on meeting others' expectations that they forgot what they actually wanted or valued. They might develop such sophisticated social skills that they no longer knew who they were beneath the performance. Opposing the persona was what Jung called the shadow, all the aspects of personality that had been rejected, denied, or pushed into unconsciousness because they conflicted with ego ideals or social expectations. Everyone had a shadow because no human being could consciously embody all aspects of their full psychological potential. The competitive person repressed their need for cooperation. The gentle person denied their capacity for aggression. The rational person rejected their emotional and intuitive sides. But the shadow did not simply disappear when ignored. It continued to exist in the unconscious, often manifesting in projection, the unconscious attribution of shadow qualities to other people. The person who had repressed their own aggression might become hypersensitive to aggression in others. The individual who denied their own selfishness might constantly criticize others for being self-centered. The shadow's energy had to go somewhere, and when it could not be consciously integrated, it often appeared in negative judgments about others who seemed to embody the rejected qualities. Jung's understanding of psychological projection was one of his most practically important insights. He realized that what we dislike most intensely in others often represents aspects of ourselves that we cannot accept. This meant that studying our strong reactions to other people could provide valuable information about our own unconscious contents, the qualities that triggered our strongest judgments, whether positive or negative, often pointed toward shadow material that needed to be consciously examined and integrated. This psychological architecture was not static but dynamic, with constant interactions between conscious and unconscious contents, between ego and shadow, between personal and collective layers of the psyche. Understanding these dynamics was essential for psychological health and personal development. Those who remained unaware of their psychological structure were doomed to be unconsciously driven by forces they did not understand. But those who could map their inner landscape gained the possibility of conscious choice and authentic self-expression. Part 2. the shadow and the problem of evil. Jung's concept of the shadow represents one of his most profound and disturbing insights into human nature. Unlike many psychological theories that viewed evil as the result of trauma, social conditioning, or mental illness, Jung recognized that every human being possessed a capacity for destructiveness that was built into the very structure of consciousness itself. The shadow was not an unfortunate accident that could be eliminated through proper education or therapy. It was an inevitable consequence of the way human consciousness develops, and an essential part of what makes us human. The shadow begins to form in early childhood when children learn which aspects of their natural behavior are acceptable to parents, teachers, and society, and which aspects must be hidden or suppressed. The aggressive impulses that might be natural for survival become unacceptable in civilized society. The selfish desires that serve individual needs conflict with social expectations of sharing and cooperation. The sexual and emotional energies that are part of human nature must be controlled and channeled according to cultural norms. All of these rejected aspects do not disappear. They get pushed into the unconscious, where they continue to exist as the shadow. This process is necessary for social development and cannot be avoided. No human being can consciously embody all aspects of their psychological potential without creating chaos in their personal and social relationships. Some degree of repression and shadow formation is required for civilization to function, but Jung understood that this necessary process created a fundamental problem for individual psychology and collective human behavior. The shadow does not remain passively hidden in the unconscious. It seeks expression through various unconscious channels that can be far more destructive than the original impulses would have been if they had been consciously acknowledged and appropriately channeled. Jung observed this shadow projection, operating at both individual and collective levels throughout his clinical work and his observation of 20th century history. Individuals would unconsciously project their own rejected qualities onto others, seeing their own greed in business competitors, their own aggression in political opponents, their own sexual impulses in groups they considered immoral. This projection allowed them to maintain a positive conscious self-image while expressing their shadow through righteous condemnation of others. At the collective level, entire nations would project their shadow onto neighboring countries or minority groups, justifying war, persecution, and genocide through the conviction that they were fighting against evil that existed only in others. Jung witnessed this process operating in Nazi Germany, where an entire nation convinced itself that its own capacity for brutality and irrationality belonged only to Jews, communists, and other targeted groups. The Germans were able to commit unprecedented atrocities while maintaining the belief that they were defending civilization against savage forces. This collective shadow projection explained why the most civilized and educated societies could suddenly become capable of extraordinary barbarism. It was not that civilization had failed, it was that civilization itself created the conditions under which shadow material could accumulate and eventually explode in destructive ways. The more a culture emphasized certain positive values, the more likely it was to repress and project the opposite qualities, creating the psychological conditions for fanaticism and violence. Jung's analysis of evil went deeper than most religious or philosophical approaches, because he recognized that shadow integration required acknowledging uncomfortable truths about human nature that most people preferred to ignore. Traditional morality often encouraged people to identify with their positive qualities and reject their negative ones. But this approach actually strengthened the shadow by feeding it more energy through constant repression. The alternative Jung proposed was shadow integration, ATC, the conscious recognition and acceptance of one's capacity for destructiveness, selfishness, and irrationality. This did not mean acting on these impulses, but rather acknowledging their existence and finding constructive ways to channel their energy. The person who could admit their own capacity for greed might become more effective in business, while also more generous in philanthropy. The individual who acknowledged their aggressive impulses might become more assertive in pursuing their goals while also more disciplined in controlling their temper. Shadow integration was not a one-time achievement, but a lifelong process that required constant vigilance and honesty. New shadow material was constantly being created as people developed and faced new life challenges. The successful professional who had integrated their early shadows around inadequacy and failure might develop new shadows around power and success. The parent who had worked through their shadows around dependency might face new challenges around control and letting go as their children matured. Jung illustrated these concepts through his analysis of various mythological and literary figures who embodied different approaches to the shadow. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde represented the dangers of complete shadow repression, SIS. The attempt to eliminate all negative impulses eventually led to their complete dominance of consciousness. Faust represented the opposite extreme, the conscious embrace of shadow power that ultimately led to corruption and destruction. The most psychologically mature figures in mythology were those who could acknowledge their shadow while maintaining ethical boundaries, heroes who could be fierce in battle but compassionate in peace, leaders who could make difficult decisions without becoming ruthless. But Jung also recognized that shadow work was not purely an individual matter. Families, organizations, and entire cultures developed collective shadows that influenced the behavior of all their members. A family might project their shadow onto one member who became the identified patient or black sheep, allowing others to feel psychologically healthy while avoiding their own issues. A corporation might project its shadow onto competitors or regulatory agencies, maintaining a positive self-image while engaging in questionable business practices. A religious community might project its shadow onto secular society or other faiths, preserving a sense of spiritual purity while expressing judgment and condemnation. Understanding these collective shadow dynamics was essential for anyone working in leadership, therapy, or social change, because individual healing could not be separated from collective healing. A person who integrated their personal shadow while remaining embedded in a family or culture that was heavily projecting its collective shadow would face constant pressure to participate in the projection or become isolated from their community. Jung's approach to evil was neither optimistic nor pessimistic, but realistic. He did not believe that shadow integration would eliminate destructiveness from human behavior, but he did believe it would make destructiveness less unconscious and therefore less dangerous. A person who knew their own capacity for cruelty was less likely to commit unconscious acts of cruelty than someone who believed they were incapable of harmful behavior. A society that acknowledged its own potential for barbarism was less likely to slide into actual barbarism than one that maintained illusions about its moral superiority. This realistic approach to human darkness was one of Jung's most valuable contributions to psychology and ethics. It provided a framework for understanding why good people could do terrible things, why moral education often failed to prevent immoral behavior, and why the most dangerous individuals and groups were often those who were most convinced of their own righteousness. Shadow work required tremendous courage, because it meant giving up comfortable illusions about oneself and facing aspects of personality that were genuinely disturbing. But Jung believed this courage was essential for psychological health and authentic relationships. Only those who could face their own darkness could truly appreciate light. Only those who acknowledged their capacity for harm could be trusted with power. Only those who had integrated their shadow could love others without trying to change them or use them to meet their own unconscious needs. Part 3. The Journey of Individuation. Jung's concept of individuation represents perhaps his most important contribution to understanding human psychological development. Unlike theories that focused on adaptation to social norms or the elimination of symptoms, individuation described a lifelong journey towards psychological wholeness and authentic self-expression. This was not a process that could be completed quickly or easily. It was the central task of human life, requiring decades of conscious work and often extending beyond a single lifetime. Individuation began with what Jung called the morning of life, the first half when the primary task was developing a strong ego and effective persona that could successfully navigate social reality. During this phase, individuals needed to establish their identity, develop their talents, find their place in society, and often create families and careers. This required a certain amount of unconsciousness and social conformity, because too much self-analysis or questioning of collective values could interfere with the practical tasks of early adulthood. But Jung observed that many people who had been successful in the first half of life began to experience a profound crisis somewhere around midlife. The goals and values that had motivated them for decades suddenly felt empty or meaningless. Relationships that had once been satisfying became superficial or conflicted. Work that had once been engaging became routine or burdensome. The persona that had served them well began to feel like a prison, and they started to question fundamental assumptions about who they were and what life was really about. This midlife crisis was not a pathological condition to be treated and eliminated, but a natural and necessary phase of psychological development that Jung called the noon of life. The psychological structures that had been appropriate for youth were no longer adequate for the challenges of maturity. The exclusive identification with ego and persona needed to give way to a broader understanding of personality that included previously unconscious material. The individuation process involved several key psychological developments that typically unfolded over many years. The first was shadow integration, Reizai, the conscious recognition and acceptance of rejected aspects of personality. This required giving up idealized self-images and facing uncomfortable truths about one's capacity for pettiness, selfishness, aggression, and other qualities that had been denied or projected onto others. Shadow work was often triggered by external events that forced people to confront their limitations. A business failure might reveal previously unconscious greed or incompetence. A relationship crisis might expose hidden selfishness or emotional immaturity. An illness might uncover denied vulnerability and dependence. These challenges were painful but psychologically necessary because they broke down rigid ego defenses and opened access to unconscious material that needed to be integrated. The second major phase of individuation involved what Jung called contra-sexual integration, the development of psychological qualities associated with the opposite gender. Men needed to integrate their anima, the feminine aspects of personality that included emotional sensitivity, intuitive wisdom, and relational skills. Women needed to integrate their animus, the masculine aspects that included logical thinking, assertive action, and spiritual authority. This did not mean that men needed to become feminine or women masculine in their external behavior. Rather, it meant developing psychological qualities that had been neglected due to social conditioning and gender expectations. A man might need to develop his capacity for nurturing and emotional expression while maintaining his masculine identity. A woman might need to develop her analytical thinking and leadership abilities while honoring her feminine nature. Contrasexual integration was often one of the most challenging aspects of individuation because it required going against deeply ingrained social expectations and personal habits. Men who had been taught to suppress emotional expression might find it terrifying to explore their feelings. Women who had been conditioned to defer to male authority might struggle with developing their own inner authority and assertiveness. But Jung observed that without this integration, people remained psychologically incomplete and dependent on others to provide what they could not access within themselves. Men who had not integrated their anima remained dependent on women to provide emotional life and relational skills. Women who had not integrated their animus remained dependent on men to provide intellectual authority and worldly effectiveness. The third crucial aspect of individuation was what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposing tensions within consciousness without immediately resolving them through one-sided identification. Most psychological problems arose from people's inability to tolerate paradox and ambiguity. They wanted to be either strong or sensitive, logical or intuitive, independent or connected, rather than learning to contain and balance these seemingly contradictory qualities. Developing the transcendent function required what Jung called holding the tension of the opposites, staying conscious while experiencing conflicting impulses, values, or desires without immediately acting to eliminate the discomfort. This was extremely difficult because the natural tendency was either to repress one side of the conflict or to swing between extremes without finding genuine integration. But when people could maintain conscious awareness while experiencing psychological opposites, something new emerged that transcended both sides of the conflict. A person struggling between independence and relationship might discover interdependence. Someone torn between rational analysis and intuitive wisdom might develop a form of knowing that honored both approaches. This transcendent function was the mechanism through which psychological growth occurred and new consciousness developed. Jung understood that individuation could not be achieved through willpower or conscious effort alone. It required what he called a religious attitude, an openness to guidance from the unconscious, and a willingness to sacrifice ego preferences for the sake of psychological wholeness. This did not necessarily involve traditional religious belief, but it did require recognizing that consciousness was not the master of personality, and that genuine growth often came through surrender to psychological processes that operated beyond ego control. Dreams played a crucial role in individuation because they provided direct communication from the unconscious about what was needed for psychological development. Jung spent decades analyzing his own dreams and those of his patients, developing sophisticated methods for understanding symbolic messages that could guide the individuation process. Dreams often compensated for conscious attitudes that had become too one-sided, pointing toward neglected aspects of personality that needed development. Active imagination was another technique Jung developed for facilitating individuation. This involved consciously engaging with unconscious images and fantasies through various creative methods: writing, drawing, movement, or simply allowing imagination to unfold while maintaining conscious awareness. Unlike passive fantasy or daydreaming, active imagination required staying present and responsive to whatever emerged from the unconscious, treating it as real communication from autonomous psychological forces. The ultimate goal of individuation was not happiness or social success, but what Jung called the realization of the self, the archetype of wholeness and meaning that represented the totality of conscious and unconscious personality. The self was not something that could be achieved or possessed, but rather a dynamic center that could be served through conscious alignment with the individuation process. People who had made significant progress in individuation often became what Jung called wounded healers. Individuals who had integrated enough of their own shadow and unconscious material to be genuinely helpful to others. Facing similar challenges, they had learned to hold space for psychological complexity and paradox without immediately trying to fix or change difficult situations. They could offer wisdom and support without imposing their own solutions or judgments. But Jung was careful to emphasize that individuation was never complete and always remained vulnerable to regression. New life challenges constantly arose that required further integration of unconscious material. Success in one area of development could create new shadows and complexes that needed attention. The individuation process was more like a spiral than a straight line, with similar themes recurring at deeper levels throughout life. Understanding individuation was crucial for anyone seeking psychological health and authentic self-expression. It provided a framework for making sense of life's challenges and transitions, seeing them not as problems to be eliminated but as opportunities for growth and integration. It offered hope for those struggling with midlife crises, relationship difficulties, or existential questions, showing that these challenges often pointed toward needed psychological development rather than personal failure. Part 4. Dreams and the language of the unconscious. Jung's revolutionary approach to dream interpretation transformed our understanding of the unconscious mind and provided practical tools for psychological development that remain valuable today. Unlike Freud, who saw dreams primarily as disguised expressions of repressed sexual impulses, Jung recognized dreams as direct communications from the unconscious that served multiple psychological functions essential for mental health and personal growth. Dreams, in Jung's understanding, represented the unconscious mind's attempt to maintain psychological balance by compensating for conscious attitudes that had become too one-sided or rigid. If someone's conscious attitude was overly optimistic and naive, their dreams might present darker, more realistic perspectives. If a person's waking consciousness was dominated by rational analysis, their dreams might emphasize emotional or intuitive content that was being neglected. This compensatory function meant that dreams should not be interpreted in isolation, but always in relationship to the dreamer's conscious situation. The same dream symbol might have completely different meanings for different dreamers depending on their personality, life circumstances, and current psychological needs. A dream about death might represent the need for psychological transformation in one person and the fear of actual loss in another. Jung identified several layers of dream meaning that needed to be explored for complete understanding. The personal layer related to the dreamer's individual history, relationships, and psychological complexes. Dream figures often represented aspects of the dreamer's personality or important people in their life. Personal symbols emerged from the dreamer's unique experiences and associations. But beneath the personal layer, Jung discovered what he called the collective layer, where dreams accessed universal archetypal themes that appeared across all cultures and historical periods. Dreams might present mythological figures, religious symbols, or narrative patterns that the dreamer had never consciously encountered, but that resonated with deep psychological truth. These archetypal dreams often occurred during times of major life transitions or psychological crisis, when the psyche needed to connect with deeper sources of wisdom and meaning. Jung's approach to dream interpretation was radically different from traditional analytical methods. Rather than reducing dream symbols to fixed meanings or focusing primarily on dream content, he emphasized the emotional and energetic qualities of dreams and their relationship to the dreamer's current life situation. He developed what he called the amplification method, which involved exploring the rich associations and cultural meanings surrounding dream symbols without imposing predetermined interpretations. The process began with the dreamer describing their dream in detail, including not just the events and images, but the emotional atmosphere, the quality of light, the relationships between dream figures, and any bodily sensations or unusual features. Jung understood that these seemingly minor details often contained crucial information about the dream's psychological message. Next, the dreamer would explore personal associations to dream elements, sharing memories, feelings, and thoughts that arose spontaneously when focusing on specific dream images. This revealed the personal layer of meaning and helped identify which psychological complexes or life situations the dream was addressing. Finally, Jung would introduce cultural and mythological amplifications, sharing knowledge about how similar symbols had appeared in various traditions, stories, and religious systems. This helped access the archetypal layer of meaning and connected the dreamer's personal experience to universal human themes. Jung discovered that dreams often came in series, with related themes and symbols developing over weeks or months as the unconscious worked through particular psychological issues. He encouraged people to keep detailed dream journals that could reveal these patterns and show how the psyche was guiding psychological development over time. One of Jung's most important insights was that dreams often presented solutions to problems that the conscious mind could not solve through rational analysis alone. When people were stuck in psychological conflicts or facing difficult life decisions, dreams might present creative alternatives that transcended the limitations of either or thinking. These solutions often came through symbolic images that needed to be understood metaphorically rather than literally. Jung also recognized that some dreams served a prospective function, pointing toward future psychological developments or warning about potential difficulties ahead. These dreams did not predict literal future events, but rather showed where the dreamer's psychological energy was heading and what kind of development was trying to emerge. A dream about starting a new job might not mean the person would literally change careers, but rather that some aspect of their personality was ready for new expression or challenge. Nightmares and disturbing dreams received special attention in Jung's approach because they often carried the most important psychological messages. Rather than viewing them as pathological symptoms to be eliminated, Jung saw them as urgent communications from the unconscious about psychological material that needed immediate attention. The emotional intensity of nightmares reflected the psychological importance of what they were trying to communicate. Shadow dreams, in which the dreamer encountered threatening or repulsive figures, often represented aspects of their own personality that had been rejected and needed integration. Rather than running from these dream figures, Jung encouraged people to engage with them consciously, asking what they wanted or what they represented. This dream dialogue could lead to important discoveries about neglected psychological needs or destructive patterns that were operating unconsciously. Anima and animus dreams, featuring idealized or problematic figures of the opposite gender, revealed information about the dreamer's relationship to their contrasexual side and their capacity for psychological wholeness. Men's dreams about women often showed their relationship to emotional life, creativity, and relational skills. Women's dreams about men often revealed their relationship to assertive action, intellectual authority, and spiritual development. Jung developed the technique of active imagination, partly as a way of continuing dream work while awake. Dreamers could re-enter their dreams imaginatively and continue conversations with dream figures, explore dream landscapes more fully, or allow dream narratives to develop further. This practice helped bridge the gap between conscious and unconscious awareness and allowed deeper integration of dream messages. The practical applications of Jung's dream work were enormous. People could use dream analysis to understand their psychological complexes, identify areas needing development, and receive guidance about important life decisions. Dreams often revealed unconscious motivations behind relationship difficulties, career dissatisfaction, or creative blocks. They provided early warnings about psychological imbalances that might otherwise develop into more serious problems. Jung's approach to dreams also had profound implications for understanding creativity and problem-solving. Many of his patients reported that dreams had provided solutions to technical problems, artistic inspiration, or business innovations that their conscious minds had been unable to generate. The unconscious mind's ability to make connections between seemingly unrelated information often produced insights that rational analysis could not achieve. But Jung emphasized that dream work required patience, practice, and respect for the unconscious mind's autonomous wisdom. Dreams could not be forced or manipulated to provide desired messages. They operated according to their own logic and timing, requiring dreamers to develop a receptive attitude and willingness to be surprised by what emerged. The therapeutic value of dream work extended beyond individual psychological development. Jung observed that families, groups, and even entire cultures could share similar dream themes during times of collective crisis or transition. Understanding these collective dream patterns could provide insight into social and political developments that were emerging from the depths of the collective unconscious. Modern research has confirmed many of Jung's insights about dreams, showing that REM sleep plays crucial roles in memory consolidation, emotional processing, and creative problem-solving. Neuroscience has identified brain networks that remain active during dreaming, supporting Jung's view that dreams represent meaningful psychological activity rather than random neural firing. Jung's legacy in dream interpretation continues to influence therapeutic practice, creativity workshops, and personal development approaches worldwide. His recognition that dreams provide direct access to unconscious wisdom has empowered countless individuals to develop deeper self-understanding and more authentic ways of living. His methods for dream interpretation remain among the most practical and effective tools available for psychological growth and healing. Part 5. Psychological types and the structure of consciousness. Jung's theory of psychological types represents one of his most influential contributions to understanding human personality and individual differences. Through decades of clinical observation, he recognized that people's psychological preferences were not simply learned behaviors or temporary states, but reflected fundamental differences in how consciousness itself was structured and operated. This insight revolutionized personality psychology and provided practical frameworks that continue to influence education, business, therapy, and personal development today. Jung's type theory emerged from his observation that even his closest colleagues and friends approached psychological questions in fundamentally different ways. Where he saw meaningful symbols and archetypal patterns, others saw only personal associations and individual psychopathology. Where he valued intuitive insights and symbolic thinking, others preferred empirical data and logical analysis. These differences could not be explained by education, culture, or personal history alone. DQI. They seem to reflect different ways of organizing and processing psychological experience. The foundation of Jung's type theory was his recognition of two fundamental psychological attitudes, extroversion and introversion. These terms, which Jung introduced to psychology, described opposite orientations of psychological energy. Extroverts directed their attention and energy primarily toward the external world of people, objects, and activities. They were energized by social interaction, stimulated by novelty and change, and tended to process their thoughts and feelings through external expression and action. Introverts, by contrast, directed their attention and energy primarily toward their inner world of thoughts, feelings, and reflections. They were energized by solitude, stimulated by depth and meaning, and tended to process their experiences through internal reflection and analysis. This did not mean introverts were shy or antisocial, but rather that their psychological orientation was fundamentally inward-turning. Jung emphasized that both attitudes were equally valuable and that healthy psychological development required access to both extroverted and introverted capacities. But he observed that most people had a natural preference for one attitude, which became their dominant mode of consciousness, while the other remained less developed and often unconscious. Beyond these basic attitudes, Jung identified 4 psychological functions that describe different ways of gathering and processing information. The first pair consisted of what he called the perceiving functions: sensation and intuition. Sensation focused on concrete, observable information gathered through the 5 senses. People who preferred sensation were practical, realistic, and attentive to immediate physical reality. They trusted what they could see, hear, touch, taste, and smell, and they valued accuracy, precision, and attention to detail. Intuition, by contrast, focused on possibilities, patterns, and potential meanings that lay beyond immediate sensory experience. People who preferred intuition were imaginative, visionary, and attentive to underlying connections and future implications. They trusted their hunches and insights, valued innovation and creativity, and often saw possibilities that others missed. The second pair consisted of what Jung called the judging functions: thinking and feeling. These functions describe different ways of making decisions and evaluating information. Thinking focused on logical analysis, objective criteria, and impersonal principles. People who preferred thinking made decisions based on rational analysis, valued fairness and justice, and strove for logical consistency in their choices. Feeling focused on values, personal significance, and the impact of decisions on people and relationships. People who preferred feeling made decisions based on what mattered most to them personally, valued harmony and authenticity, and considered the human consequences of their choices. Jung emphasized that feeling was not emotion, but rather a rational function for evaluating importance and meaning. Each person developed one of these four functions as their dominant or superior function, which became their primary way of interacting with the world. A second function typically developed to support the dominant function, while the other two functions remained relatively unconscious and underdeveloped. Jung called the least developed function the inferior function, which often operated unconsciously and could create psychological problems when it was completely neglected. This created 8 basic psychological types: extroverted thinking, introverted thinking, extroverted feeling, introverted feeling, extroverted sensation, introverted sensation, extroverted intuition, and introverted intuition. Each type had its own characteristic strengths, blind spots, and patterns of development. Extroverted thinking types excelled at organizing external systems, managing logistics, and applying logical principles to practical problems. They became effective administrators, engineers, and analysts who could bring order to complex situations through systematic analysis. However, they often struggled with understanding their own emotions and the emotional needs of others, sometimes appearing cold or insensitive despite having no intention to harm. Introverted thinking types developed sophisticated theoretical frameworks and deep analytical abilities. They became philosophers, researchers, and theorists who could penetrate to the essential principles underlying complex phenomena, but they often had difficulty communicating their insights to others and translating their theories into practical applications, sometimes appearing detached from everyday reality. Extroverted feeling types excelled at understanding and harmonizing human relationships. They became natural counselors, teachers, and community leaders who could sense what others needed and create environments where people felt valued and understood. However, they sometimes struggled with setting boundaries and making decisions that might disappoint others, occasionally losing touch with their own authentic needs and values. Introverted feeling types developed deep personal values and authentic self-understanding. They became artists, writers, and advocates who could express profound truths about human experience and stand up for what they believed was right. But they often had difficulty expressing their values in ways others could understand, and sometimes appeared judgmental or aloof when their values were threatened. The sensation types, both extroverted and introverted, excelled at dealing with concrete reality and practical details. Extroverted sensation types became skilled at managing physical resources, responding to immediate needs, and enjoying sensory experiences. Introverted sensation types developed careful attention to internal physical states and detailed memory for past experiences. But both sensation types often struggled with seeing future possibilities and understanding abstract meanings that were not immediately present. The intuitive types, both extroverted and introverted, excelled at seeing possibilities and understanding symbolic meanings. Extroverted intuition types became innovators and catalysts who could generate new ideas and inspire others to embrace change. Introverted intuition types developed visionary insights and could understand complex patterns and future implications. But both intuitive types often struggled with attention to practical details and following through on their inspirations with concrete action. Jung emphasized that no type was superior to others. Each had essential contributions to make to human civilization. The diversity of psychological types was necessary for addressing the full range of challenges that societies faced. Thinking types provided logical analysis and systematic organization. Feeling types contributed values-based decision-making and attention to human welfare. Sensation types offered practical skills and attention to immediate needs. Intuitive types supplied innovation and vision for future development. Problems arose not from having particular type preferences, but from several related issues. First, people often became trapped in their dominant function. and failed to develop their other psychological capabilities. This created one-sided personalities that could excel in some areas while remaining incompetent in others. Second, people frequently assumed that their own psychological preferences were universal and judged others negatively for approaching life differently. Third, families, schools, and organizations often favored certain types while devaluing others, creating environments where some people could thrive while others felt constantly misunderstood or inadequate. Jung's type theory provided frameworks for understanding and resolving these problems. By recognizing their own type preferences, people could understand their natural strengths, while also identifying areas that needed conscious development. By understanding others' type preferences, they could appreciate different approaches to life and communicate more effectively across psychological differences. The therapeutic implications of type theory were profound. Many psychological problems arose from trying to function in ways that contradicted natural type preferences, or from failing to develop psychological functions that were needed for life circumstances. A naturally introverted person who was forced into highly extroverted work might develop anxiety and exhaustion. A thinking type who suppressed their feeling function might struggle with relationship problems and decision-making difficulties. Jung also observed that the inferior function, while being a person's weakest psychological area, often held the key to psychological growth and individuation. Learning to integrate the inferior function required tremendous patience and humility because it meant functioning in ways that felt awkward and unnatural. But this integration was essential for psychological wholeness and often provided access to creative insights and renewed life energy. The relationship between psychological types and individuation was complex and crucial to understand. In the first half of life, people needed to develop their dominant function and establish their place in the world through their natural strengths. But in the second half of life, individuation required developing the other functions, particularly the inferior function, to achieve greater psychological balance and wisdom. Jung's type theory has had enormous influence on personality assessment, career counseling, team building, and educational approaches. Various tests and instruments have been developed to help people identify their psychological preferences. Though Jung himself was skeptical about reducing the complexity of human personality to simple categories or scores, the enduring value of Jung's type theory lies not in its ability to predict behavior or place people in fixed categories, but in its recognition that psychological diversity is both natural and necessary. Understanding type differences helps people appreciate their own gifts while respecting others' different approaches to life. It provides frameworks for personal development that honor individual differences while encouraging growth toward greater psychological wholeness. Part 6. The collective unconscious and archetypal patterns. Jung's discovery of the collective unconscious represents one of the most revolutionary concepts in the history of psychology, fundamentally challenging Western assumptions about the nature of individual consciousness and its relationship to universal human experience. Through careful analysis of dreams, myths, religious symbols, and psychotic fantasies, Jung uncovered evidence for a deeper layer of the psyche that contained universal patterns and images shared by all humanity, regardless of cultural background or personal history. The collective unconscious was not learned through experience or cultural transmission, but inherited as part of the basic structure of human consciousness itself. Just as all humans inherit similar physical characteristics, eye, 2 eyes, 1 heart, 10 fingers, Jung argued that we also inherit similar psychological structures that predispose us to organize experience in universal ways. These inherited psychological patterns he called archetypes. Archetypes were not specific images or symbols, but rather underlying forms or templates that shaped how humans perceive and respond to fundamental life situations. The mother archetype predisposed humans to recognize and respond to nurturing figures in characteristic ways. The hero archetype activated in response to challenges that required courage and perseverance. The wise old man archetype emerged when guidance and wisdom were needed. The shadow archetype represented the rejected and denied aspects of personality that nonetheless demanded recognition. These archetypal patterns manifested differently in different cultures and historical periods, but their basic structure remained constant across time and geography. The Great Mother might appear as Demeter in Greek mythology, as Kali in Hindu tradition, as the Virgin Mary in Christianity, or as Mother Earth in indigenous cultures. But whether nurturing or devouring, creative or destructive, the maternal archetype carried similar psychological energy and meaning across all these manifestations. Jung's evidence for the collective unconscious came from multiple sources that could not be explained by conventional theories about learning and cultural influence. Patients with no knowledge of mythology would produce dreams and fantasies containing images and themes that appeared in ancient religious traditions from around the world. Children would spontaneously create drawings and stories that paralleled mythological motifs they had never encountered. People experiencing psychotic episodes would often become possessed by archetypal figures and speak in ways that resembled ancient oracles and shamanic visions. Perhaps most compelling was Jung's observation that certain symbols appeared with remarkable consistency across cultures that had no historical contact with each other. The mandala, a circular design representing wholeness and integration, appeared in Tibetan Buddhism, Native American sand paintings, Christian rose windows, and spontaneous drawings by Jung's patients who knew nothing about these traditions. The tree of life connecting heaven and earth appeared in Norse mythology, Kabbalistic symbolism, and the unconscious productions of modern individuals seeking meaning and direction. Jung spent years documenting these cross-cultural parallels in symbols, myths, and religious imagery. He studied alchemy, Gnosticism, Eastern philosophy, and primitive religions, demonstrating how similar archetypal themes appeared in vastly different contexts. This research convinced him that the human psyche possessed an inherited symbolic language that transcended individual and cultural differences. The archetypal layer of the psyche served several crucial psychological functions. First, it provided meaning and orientation during major life transitions when conventional social roles and identities were insufficient. The archetypal hero's journey provided a template for understanding the challenges of adolescence and early adulthood. The archetype of death and rebirth offered frameworks for making sense of midlife crises and spiritual transformations. The wise old woman, or man archetype, activated during later life to provide guidance about aging, legacy, and preparation for death. Second, archetypes connected individuals to sources of energy and inspiration that transcended personal limitations. When people felt overwhelmed by challenges that seemed beyond their individual capacity, archetypal identification could provide access to transpersonal strength and wisdom. The person facing a seemingly impossible task might draw upon hero energy. Someone called to nurture others might access the inexhaustible resources of the Great Mother. An individual seeking to understand life's mysteries might connect with the sage or hermit archetype. Third, archetypes provided frameworks for understanding and integrating unconscious psychological content. Dreams and fantasies often presented archetypal figures that represented aspects of the dreamer's personality that needed attention or development. A woman might dream of a wise old woman who offered guidance about accessing her own inner wisdom. A man might encounter a wild, powerful animal that represented neglected instinctual energy. These archetypal dreams provided symbolic maps for psychological development that could guide the individuation process. But Jung also recognized that archetypal energy could be dangerous when it possessed individuals unconsciously. People who became identified with archetypal roles often lost their individual humanity and began acting in ways that served the archetype rather than their authentic self. The person possessed by the hero archetype might become grandiose and reckless, taking on challenges that were genuinely beyond their capacity. Someone identified with the Great Mother might become controlling and intrusive, unable to allow others their own autonomy and growth. Political leaders were particularly susceptible to archetypal possession because their social roles naturally activated archetypal projections from followers. A leader who became identified with the wise king archetype might begin to believe in their own infallibility and lose touch with their human limitations. Someone possessed by the warrior archetype might become addicted to conflict and unable to recognize when diplomatic solutions were more appropriate than aggressive action. Jung observed that entire cultures could become possessed by particular archetypal patterns during times of crisis or transition. Germany during the Nazi period had become possessed by a destructive version of the warrior, hero archetype that glorified violence and conquest, while projecting all shadow qualities onto other groups. The Soviet Union had become possessed by the archetypal father, king pattern that promised to create paradise through total control and the elimination of all opposition. These collective archetypal possessions were among the most dangerous psychological phenomena Jung identified because they could mobilize enormous energy while bypassing individual moral judgment and critical thinking. People caught up in archetypal movements often felt they were serving something greater than themselves, which made them willing to commit acts they would never consider in their individual capacity. Understanding archetypal patterns was therefore crucial for both individual psychological development and collective social health. On the individual level, recognizing archetypal influences could help people access transpersonal sources of energy and meaning, while avoiding unconscious possession by forces they did not understand. On the collective level, understanding archetypal dynamics could help societies recognize when they were being driven by unconscious patterns rather than conscious choice. Jung developed various methods for working consciously with archetypal energy. Active imagination allowed people to dialogue with archetypal figures that appeared in their dreams or fantasies, learning what these figures wanted and how their energy could be integrated constructively. Amplification helped people understand the cultural and historical context of archetypal symbols, enriching their personal relationship to universal patterns. Creative expression through art, writing, or movement provided channels for archetypal energy that honored its transpersonal quality while keeping it connected to individual consciousness. The therapeutic implications of archetypal psychology were profound. Many psychological problems arose from disconnection from archetypal sources of meaning and energy. Depression often involved feeling cut off from transpersonal purpose and significance. Anxiety frequently resulted from encountering archetypal energies without adequate frameworks for understanding and integrating them. Relationship difficulties commonly involved projecting archetypal patterns onto partners who could not possibly fulfill such transpersonal expectations. Jung's work with the collective unconscious also had important implications for understanding creativity and cultural development. Artists, writers, musicians, and other creative individuals often served as channels through which archetypal patterns could enter collective consciousness in new forms. The greatest works of art and literature resonated across cultures and centuries because they gave expression to universal archetypal themes that spoke to fundamental human concerns. Religious and spiritual traditions could be understood as collective attempts to create conscious relationships with archetypal patterns that would otherwise remain unconscious and potentially dangerous. Rituals, ceremonies, and spiritual practices provided containers for archetypal energy that allowed communities to access transpersonal meaning while maintaining psychological safety and social cohesion. Modern secular culture's rejection of traditional religious frameworks had created what Jung saw as a dangerous void in collective consciousness. Without adequate containers for archetypal energy, modern people were vulnerable to unconscious possession by political ideologies, consumer fantasies, celebrity cults, and other substitute forms of transpersonal meaning that lacked the wisdom accumulated through centuries of religious practice. Jung's vision of the collective unconscious provided hope for bridging the divisions between individual and collective psychology, between scientific and spiritual approaches to human nature, and between Western and Eastern understanding of consciousness. By recognizing that human consciousness was not isolated and individual but connected to universal patterns and energies, Jung offered frameworks for healing the alienation and fragmentation that characterized modern life, while maintaining respect for both scientific rigor and spiritual wisdom. Part 7. Active imagination and the creative process. Jung's development of active imagination represents one of his most innovative contributions to psychological healing and personal development. This technique emerged from his own psychological crisis and became a cornerstone of his therapeutic approach, offering people direct access to unconscious wisdom and creative potential that could transform their understanding of themselves and their relationship to life. Active imagination was born from necessity during Jung's confrontation with the unconscious, following his break with Freud in 1913. Facing what he later described as a complete mental breakdown, Jung found himself overwhelmed by powerful images, fantasies, and emotions that seemed to emerge from depths beyond his personal unconscious. Traditional therapeutic approaches offered no guidance for working with such intense psychological material, forcing Jung to develop entirely new methods for maintaining consciousness while engaging directly with autonomous unconscious contents. The process began when Jung made a conscious decision to surrender his adult rationality and allow himself to fall into his fantasies as he had done as a child. But unlike passive daydreaming or uncontrolled psychotic episodes, active imagination required maintaining dual consciousness, RUZO, staying aware that one was imagining while simultaneously allowing the imagination complete freedom to unfold according to its own logic and direction. This dual consciousness was extremely difficult to achieve and maintain. The natural tendency was either to control the imagination through conscious direction or to become completely lost in fantasy without any observing awareness. Active imagination required finding a middle path that honored both conscious and unconscious contributions to the psychological dialogue. The technique involved several key elements that distinguished it from other forms of imaginative activity. First, it required a genuine attitude of respect and curiosity toward whatever emerged from the unconscious. Images, figures, and scenarios that appeared during active imagination needed to be treated as autonomous psychological entities with their own intelligence and agenda, rather than as projections of conscious wishes or fears. Second, active imagination involved direct engagement and dialogue with unconscious contents. Rather than simply observing fantasies passively, practitioners were encouraged to interact with the figures and situations that appeared, asking questions, expressing concerns, and entering into genuine relationships with these inner personalities. Jung discovered that unconscious figures could provide information, guidance, and perspectives that were unavailable to conscious awareness. Third, the process required careful attention to the ethical dimensions of imaginative encounters. Just as in external relationships, interactions with unconscious figures needed to be conducted with integrity, honesty, and respect for their autonomous nature. Trying to manipulate or control unconscious contents for conscious purposes inevitably led to resistance and the withdrawal of imaginative cooperation. Fourth, active imagination needed to be grounded in conscious life through creative expression and practical integration. The insights and energies accessed through imaginative work required translation into concrete forms, artistic creation, behavioral changes, or new approaches to life challenges. Without this grounding, active imagination could become merely escapist fantasy that provided temporary relief without promoting genuine psychological development. Jung used active imagination extensively in his own psychological work, producing thousands of pages of dialogues, drawings, and symbolic expressions that documented his encounter with archetypal figures and themes. His famous Red Book, compiled during his years of psychological crisis, contained elaborate artistic representations of his active imagination experiences, along with careful analysis of their meaning and significance for his psychological development. Through this personal work, Jung encountered various archetypal figures that became central to his understanding of the individuation process. Philemon, an elderly wise man with the horns of a bull and the wings of a bird, served as Jung's inner teacher and guide to understanding the objective reality of psychic contents. Salome, a blind prophetess, represented the irrational, instinctual side of wisdom that complemented Philemon's more intellectual guidance. The Red One, a demonic figure associated with violence and sexuality, embodied shadow aspects that Jung needed to acknowledge and integrate. These encounters convinced Jung that the unconscious contained autonomous psychological entities that possessed their own intelligence, intentions, and developmental agendas. They were not merely symbols or projections, but genuine psychological presences that could provide guidance, challenge assumptions, and facilitate growth in ways that conscious analysis could not achieve. Jung began introducing active imagination to his patients and discovered that it could be remarkably effective for accessing psychological resources that were unavailable through traditional therapeutic conversation. Patients who had been stuck in repetitive patterns or unable to access emotional material often found that active imagination opened doorways to new understanding and healing possibilities. The technique proved particularly valuable for people struggling with creative blocks, relationship difficulties, and existential questions about meaning and purpose. Artists and writers found that dialogue with inner figures could provide inspiration and overcome creative inhibitions. People facing difficult life decisions discovered that imaginative exploration could reveal perspectives and options that rational analysis had missed. Individuals seeking spiritual understanding found that active imagination could provide direct access to transpersonal wisdom and guidance. However, Jung was careful to emphasize that active imagination was not appropriate for everyone and required certain psychological prerequisites. People needed sufficient ego strength to maintain consciousness during imaginative encounters without being overwhelmed by unconscious contents. They required enough life experience and psychological stability to integrate the insights and energies that emerged from the work. And they needed genuine motivation for psychological development rather than mere curiosity or entertainment. Jung also recognized various dangers and pitfalls associated with active imagination. People could become addicted to imaginative experiences and lose interest in external reality and practical responsibilities. They might become identified with powerful archetypal figures and develop grandiose fantasies about their own importance or specialness. They could use active imagination as a form of psychological masturbation that provided temporary satisfaction without promoting genuine growth or integration. To prevent these problems, Jung emphasized the importance of proper preparation, ongoing support, and careful attention to the relationship between imaginative work and practical life. Active imagination was not a substitute for living, but a supplement that could enrich and deepen one's engagement with reality. The creative implications of active imagination extended far beyond individual therapy into realms of artistic expression, scientific discovery, and cultural innovation. Jung observed that many great artists and inventors had used processes similar to active imagination to access creative inspiration that transcended their conscious knowledge and abilities. Mozart described musical compositions arriving in his consciousness as complete wholes that he simply had to transcribe. Einstein reported that his scientific insights often came through visual and kinesthetic imagination rather than logical reasoning. Blake claimed that his poems and paintings were dictated by spiritual entities that he encountered through visionary experiences. These accounts suggested that creative genius often involved conscious collaboration with autonomous, unconscious sources of inspiration. Jung's understanding of active imagination also illuminated the psychological dynamics underlying religious and spiritual experiences throughout history. Mystical visions, prophetic dreams, and shamanic journeys could be understood as naturally occurring forms of active imagination that provided individuals and communities with access to transpersonal wisdom and guidance. But Jung was careful to distinguish between authentic active imagination and various forms of psychological inflation or fantasy that might superficially resemble genuine inner work. True active imagination required humility, discipline, and willingness to be changed by the encounter with unconscious contents. It was not about getting what one wanted from the unconscious, but about discovering what the unconscious wanted from consciousness. The technique continued to evolve throughout Jung's career as he refined his understanding of how to work safely and effectively with unconscious material. He developed specific approaches for different types of psychological problems and different stages of psychological development. He trained other analysts in the method and encouraged research into its applications and limitations. Active imagination became one of the distinguishing features of Jungian analysis, setting it apart from other therapeutic approaches that focused primarily on insight and interpretation. By providing direct access to unconscious creativity and wisdom, active imagination offered possibilities for psychological transformation that could not be achieved through rational analysis alone. The legacy of Jung's work with active imagination continues to influence contemporary approaches to therapy, creativity, and spiritual development. Various forms of guided imagery, creative visualization, and expressive arts therapy have drawn upon Jung's insights about the healing potential of conscious engagement with unconscious contents. Modern neuroscience has begun to provide biological understanding of the psychological processes that Jung identified through active imagination. Research on default mode networks, creative cognition, and the neurobiology of imagination supports Jung's observations about the autonomous nature of unconscious mental activity and its crucial role in psychological health and creative functioning. Perhaps most importantly, active imagination offered a practical method for bridging the gap between scientific and spiritual approaches to human development. It required neither religious faith nor rejection of rational thinking, but rather a mature integration of both approaches that could honor the full complexity of human consciousness. Part 8. Synchronicity and meaningful coincidences. Jung's concept of synchronicity represents one of his most controversial yet fascinating contributions to understanding the nature of reality and consciousness. Through decades of careful observation, Jung identified a principle of meaningful coincidence that operated beyond the conventional laws of causality, suggesting that mind and matter were connected in ways that mainstream science had not yet recognized or accepted. Synchronicity emerged from Jung's clinical observation that significant psychological developments in his patients were often accompanied by meaningful coincidences in their external lives. A patient struggling with psychological rigidity might encounter a series of situations requiring flexibility and adaptation. Someone working through grief might experience unexpected encounters with symbols of renewal and rebirth. An individual facing important life decisions might notice repeated appearances of relevant guidance in conversations, books, or chance encounters. These coincidences seem too frequent and too precisely meaningful to be explained by random chance alone. They appeared to reflect some kind of ordering principle that connected inner psychological states with outer circumstances in ways that served psychological development and individuation. Jung's most famous example of synchronicity involved a patient who was describing a dream about a golden scarab beetle when an actual scarab beetle flew into his office window. This perfectly timed coincidence created a breakthrough moment that allowed the patient to move beyond intellectual resistance and experience genuine psychological transformation. The external event seemed to mirror and support the psychological process that was occurring internally. But synchronicity was not merely about coincidences that felt meaningful to individuals experiencing them. Jung argued that it represented a fundamental principle of reality that complemented but transcended conventional causal relationships. While causality explained how events were connected through chains of physical influence, Synchronicity described connections based on meaning and significance that operated outside linear time and space. This concept emerged partly from Jung's collaboration with physicist Wolfgang Pauli, who had become fascinated by the parallels between quantum mechanical phenomena and psychological processes. Quantum mechanics had revealed that subatomic particles could exhibit mysterious connections that transcended conventional notions of separate objects interacting through physical forces. Pauli and Jung wondered whether similar principles might operate at the level of psychological and social phenomena. Jung identified 3 types of synchronistic phenomena that operated according to different principles but shared the common feature of meaningful coincidence. The first type involved coincidences between psychological states and external events that occurred simultaneously. The scarab beetle example represented this category, where inner and outer events coincided in ways that felt meaningful and significant. The second type involved coincidences between psychological states and future events that were not yet physically causally connected to present circumstances. Precognitive dreams and intuitive insights that later proved accurate belonged to this category. Jung documented numerous cases where patients' dreams or fantasies accurately predicted future developments that could not have been anticipated through normal reasoning. The third type involved meaningful coincidences between psychological states and past events that the individual had no normal way of knowing about. This included cases of apparent telepathy, clairvoyance, and access to historical information that was not available through conventional channels. Jung was particularly interested in instances where patients produced archetypal material that paralleled historical or mythological themes they had never consciously encountered. Jung's approach to synchronicity was methodical and empirical, rather than mystical or superstitious. He documented hundreds of synchronistic experiences, analyzing their patterns and attempting to understand the conditions under which they were most likely to occur. He found that synchronicities were more frequent during periods of psychological transformation, emotional intensity, and archetypal activation. People undergoing major life transitions, adolescence, midlife crisis, bereavement, spiritual awakening, reported more synchronistic experiences than those in stable psychological states. Individuals working actively on psychological development through therapy, meditation, or creative expression seem to encounter meaningful coincidences more frequently than those living primarily unconscious lives. Jung also observed that synchronicities often involved archetypal symbols and themes that connected personal experience to universal patterns. The specific content of synchronistic events frequently reflected the archetypal material that was being activated in the individual's psychological development. Someone working with mother issues might encounter repeated references to maternal figures. A person exploring their shadow might notice increased encounters with symbolic representations of darkness and hidden aspects of life. But Jung was careful to distinguish genuine synchronicity from various forms of psychological projection, wishful thinking, and pattern seeking that could create the illusion of meaningful coincidence. True synchronicity involved events that were objectively verifiable and whose meaningfulness extended beyond the individual's personal associations and desires. He developed criteria for identifying authentic synchronistic experiences that included emotional significance, archetypal content, and objective verifiability. The coincidence needed to feel genuinely meaningful rather than merely interesting. It needed to involve universal themes rather than purely personal references, and it needed to be factually accurate rather than based on misinterpretation or wishful perception. The implications of synchronicity extended far beyond individual psychology into questions about the nature of time, causality, and the relationship between consciousness and physical reality. If meaningful coincidences occurred more frequently than chance probability would predict, this suggested that reality was organized according to principles that transcended mechanical causation. Jung proposed that synchronicity operated through what he called the acausal orderedness of the universe, an inherent tendency for meaningful patterns to emerge that was not dependent on chains of physical cause and effect. This ordering principle seemed to be activated by psychological states of openness, attention, and emotional significance. The concept had profound implications for understanding creativity, scientific discovery, and spiritual experience. Many breakthrough insights in art and science had emerged through synchronistic processes, where external events provided the missing pieces needed to complete internal developments. Darwin's insights about evolution were triggered by reading Malthus on population. Kekulé's discovery of the benzene ring structure came through a dream. Einstein's relativity theory emerged from thought experiments that connected mathematical insights with physical intuitions. Religious and spiritual traditions throughout history had recognized similar phenomena through concepts like providence, divine guidance, and karmic connections. Jung's synchronicity provided a psychological framework for understanding these experiences, without requiring specific religious beliefs or supernatural explanations. But synchronicity also raised difficult questions about free will, determinism, and the nature of meaning itself. If external events could be meaningfully connected to internal psychological states, what did this suggest about individual autonomy and responsibility? Were synchronistic experiences evidence of some kind of cosmic intelligence, or simply the result of sophisticated pattern recognition by unconscious psychological processes? Jung avoided taking definitive positions on these metaphysical questions, preferring to document the phenomena and explore their psychological significance without making claims about ultimate reality. He saw synchronicity as an empirical fact that needed to be acknowledged and studied rather than explained away through reductive materialism or inflated into grandiose spiritual theories. The practical implications of understanding synchronicity were significant for both therapy and personal development. Paying attention to meaningful coincidences could provide valuable information about psychological development and life direction. Synchronistic events often pointed toward aspects of experience that needed attention or indicated when psychological work was moving in productive directions. However, Jung warned against becoming obsessed with synchronicity or using it as a substitute for rational thinking and practical action. Synchronistic awareness needed to be balanced with common sense, critical thinking, and personal responsibility. People could become psychologically inflated by synchronistic experiences, believing that they had special cosmic significance or that external events would automatically provide solutions to all their problems. The healthy approach to synchronicity involved maintaining openness to meaningful coincidences while continuing to engage actively and responsibly with practical life challenges. Synchronistic events could provide guidance and confirmation, but they could not replace the need for conscious choice, ethical decision-making, and sustained effort towards psychological and spiritual development. Jung's work on synchronicity continues to influence contemporary discussions about consciousness, quantum physics, and the nature of reality. While mainstream science remains skeptical about causal connections between mind and matter, research in areas like quantum entanglement, consciousness studies, and complex systems theory has identified phenomena that seem to parallel Jung's observations about meaningful coincidence. Perhaps most importantly, synchronicity offered a framework for understanding experiences that were personally meaningful but scientifically anomalous. By providing psychological rather than metaphysical explanations for these phenomena, Jung created space for acknowledging the full richness of human experience without abandoning scientific rigor or rational thinking. The concept of synchronicity exemplified Jung's broader approach to psychology, which sought to honor both empirical observation and subjective meaning, both scientific method and spiritual insight. It represented his conviction that human consciousness was connected to larger patterns of meaning and significance that transcended individual psychology while remaining grounded in careful observation of actual human experience. Part 9. The confrontation with modernity and the crisis of meaning. Jung witnessed the birth of the modern world with all its unprecedented possibilities and devastating consequences. He lived through 2 world wars, the rise and fall of totalitarian movements, the development of nuclear weapons, and the emergence of mass society with its technological marvels and spiritual emptiness. His psychological insights were forged in the crucible of these historical upheavals, and his work represents a profound diagnosis of the psychological crisis that underlies modern civilization's external achievements and internal contradictions. For Jung, the fundamental problem of modernity was not technological or political, but psychological and spiritual. Modern civilization had achieved unprecedented mastery over the external world, while simultaneously losing touch with the internal world of meaning, purpose, and spiritual significance. This imbalance created psychological conditions that made individuals vulnerable to various forms of possession, BDI, by political ideologies, consumer fantasies, technological obsessions, and other substitutes for authentic spiritual connection. The crisis began, in Jung's analysis, with the Enlightenment's rejection of traditional religious and mythological frameworks that had previously provided meaning and orientation for human life. While this rejection had freed human reason from superstitious constraints and enabled scientific progress, it had also created a dangerous vacuum in collective consciousness that was inevitably filled by various forms of secular ideology and materialistic pseudo-religion. Rationalism had promised that human reason could solve all problems and answer all important questions, but it had failed to provide the sense of transcendent purpose and meaning that human beings required for psychological health. Scientific materialism had explained the mechanisms of physical reality with unprecedented precision, but it had reduced human beings to biological machines without inherent dignity or cosmic significance. Individual autonomy had liberated people from traditional authorities and social constraints, but it had also isolated them from the organic communities and cultural traditions that had previously provided identity and belonging. The modern individual was free to choose their own values and create their own meaning, but this freedom often became a burden that led to anxiety, depression, and existential despair. Jung observed that these psychological problems were not merely individual pathologies, but collective symptoms of a civilization that had lost its soul. The epidemics of neurosis, addiction, and depression that characterized modern society reflected deeper spiritual hunger that could not be satisfied by material prosperity or technological innovation. The political catastrophes of the 20th century, e.g., fascism, communism, when people lost connection to authentic sources of meaning and transcendence, they became vulnerable to ideologies that promised to restore purpose and significance through identification with political movements that offered pseudo-religious substitutes for genuine spiritual experience. Jung had predicted these developments through his understanding of archetypal psychology and the collective unconscious. When archetypal energies were not consciously integrated through authentic spiritual practice and individual development, they became unconsciously projected onto political leaders and social movements that promised to fulfill archetypal longings for heroism, meaning, and transcendence. The masses who enthusiastically supported totalitarian movements were not primarily motivated by rational political analysis, but by unconscious psychological needs that these movements seemed to promise to fulfill. The Nazi phenomenon could not be understood through conventional political or economic analysis, but required recognition of how archetypal energies of the folk soul, the heroic leader, and the apocalyptic transformation had possessed an entire culture that had lost its spiritual moorings. But Jung's analysis extended beyond political extremism to include the more subtle forms of psychological possession that characterized everyday life in modern consumer society. People who could not find authentic meaning and purpose in their work, relationships, and creative expression often became possessed by consumer identities, celebrity fantasies, or technological obsessions that provided temporary relief from existential emptiness without addressing its underlying causes. The advertising industry deliberately exploited archetypal imagery and psychological needs to sell products that promised to fulfill spiritual longings through material consumption. The cult of celebrity provided substitute heroes and goddesses who could carry projections of archetypal significance. the entertainment industry created virtual worlds that offered escape from the meaninglessness of ordinary life, while preventing the kind of authentic psychological work that could address the root causes of alienation. Jung saw these developments as symptoms of what he called the spiritual problem of modern man. Technological civilization had developed extraordinary external capabilities, while neglecting the internal development that was necessary for psychological health and authentic human fulfillment. The result was a form of progress that increased material comfort while creating unprecedented forms of psychological suffering. The solution Jung proposed was not a return to traditional religious beliefs or pre-modern ways of life, but rather the development of new forms of consciousness that could integrate scientific knowledge with spiritual wisdom. Modern people needed to rediscover their connection to the archetypal depths of the psyche while maintaining critical thinking and individual responsibility. This required what Jung called a new ethic, based on individual psychological development rather than collective moral rules. Instead of following external authorities or social conventions, mature individuals needed to develop their own relationship to the unconscious sources of meaning and guidance while taking full responsibility for their choices and their consequences. The individuation process was not merely personal therapy, but a form of cultural healing that could help address the collective psychological crisis of modern civilization. Individuals who had integrated their shadow material, developed their inferior functions, and established conscious relationship with archetypal energies could serve as bridges between the conscious and unconscious dimensions of collective life. These individuated people could not solve the collective problems of modern society, but they could serve as islands of psychological health and authentic meaning in a sea of cultural confusion and spiritual emptiness. Their example could inspire others to undertake their own journey towards psychological wholeness and spiritual authenticity. Jung emphasized that this inner work was not escapist or socially irresponsible, but rather the most practical contribution that individuals could make to collective healing. External political and social changes were necessary but insufficient for addressing the psychological roots of modern problems. Without inner transformation, political revolutions simply replaced one form of unconscious possession with another. The therapeutic implications of Jung's cultural analysis were profound. Individual psychological problems could not be separated from the collective context in which they occurred. Depression, anxiety, addiction, and other common disorders often reflected the individual's sensitive response to collective psychological toxicity rather than purely personal pathology. Effective therapy needed to help people understand how their individual symptoms connected to larger cultural patterns, while empowering them to develop their own authentic relationship to meaning and purpose. This required going beyond symptom relief to address fundamental questions about how to live meaningfully in a culture that had lost its spiritual center. Jung's vision for cultural renewal was both realistic and hopeful. He did not expect rapid collective transformation or the elimination of modern problems through psychological insight alone, but he did believe that individual psychological development could create the foundation for gradual cultural healing that might take generations to unfold fully. The seeds of this renewal were already present in various movements towards psychological awareness, spiritual exploration, and creative expression that were emerging throughout modern society. Psychology itself, despite its limitations, represented humanity's attempt to understand and heal the wounds created by technological civilization's neglect of inner development. Jung believed that the crisis of meaning would ultimately force humanity to rediscover the spiritual dimensions of existence, but this rediscovery would need to take forms appropriate to modern consciousness. It could not involve simple return to traditional religious beliefs, but would require new syntheses of scientific knowledge and spiritual wisdom that could satisfy both rational intellect and spiritual longing. The emergence of depth psychology, the growing interest in Eastern philosophy and meditation practices, the development of expressive arts and creativity movements, and the increasing recognition of ecological interconnectedness all represented early signs of the cultural transformation that Jung believed was necessary for humanity's continued psychological and spiritual evolution. But this transformation would not be easy or automatic. It would require countless individuals to undertake the difficult work of psychological development and spiritual maturation. It would demand new forms of education that honored both intellectual development and emotional wisdom. It would necessitate economic and political structures that supported human flourishing rather than merely material accumulation. Most importantly, it would require a fundamental shift in consciousness, from identification with ego and external achievement to recognition of the deeper self that connected individual awareness to transpersonal sources of meaning and wisdom. This was not a collective solution that could be imposed from outside, but an individual process that each person needed to undertake for themselves while remaining connected to the larger human community. Jung's analysis of modernity was both sobering and inspiring. He offered no easy solutions or utopian promises, but he did provide frameworks for understanding how individual psychological development could contribute to collective healing and cultural renewal. His vision represented hope grounded in realistic assessment of human nature and historical possibility, rather than naive optimism about inevitable progress. Part 10: The Integration of Opposites and Jung's Legacy for Human Consciousness. At the heart of Carl Jung's psychological vision lies a profound understanding that human wholeness emerges not through the elimination of conflict and contradiction, but through the conscious integration of opposing forces within personality and culture. This insight represents perhaps his most enduring contribution to understanding human development and offers a path forward for individuals and societies struggling with the polarization and fragmentation that characterize contemporary life. Jung's concept of the transcendent function described the psychological process through which opposing elements within personality could be integrated into new forms of consciousness that transcended the limitations of either pole. This was not mere compromise or averaging of differences, but rather the emergence of genuinely new psychological possibilities that honored the essential truth contained in each side of the conflict. Throughout his work, Jung identified numerous fundamental opposites that required integration for psychological health and spiritual development. The conscious and unconscious minds needed to be brought into productive dialogue rather than remaining split and antagonistic. Thinking and feeling functions required balance rather than one-sided development that left individuals either emotionally sterile or rationally confused. Individual autonomy and collective belonging needed integration rather than the false choice between selfish isolation and conformist loss of identity. Perhaps most fundamentally, Jung recognized that the relationship between ego consciousness and the deeper self represented the central dynamic of psychological development. The ego's natural tendency toward independence and control needed to be balanced by recognition of its dependence on unconscious sources of wisdom, creativity, and renewal. This did not mean ego dissolution or passive surrender to unconscious forces, but rather conscious collaboration between different levels of psychological functioning. This integration could not be achieved through intellectual understanding alone, but required what Jung called living the tension, staying consciously present while experiencing the full force of psychological contradiction without immediately acting to eliminate the discomfort. Most people could tolerate psychological tension for only brief periods before reverting to familiar patterns of one-sided identification. But those who could maintain consciousness while experiencing opposites often found that new insights and possibilities emerged that neither side of the conflict could have generated independently. Jung illustrated this process through his analysis of religious and mystical traditions, which had consistently recognized that spiritual development required integration of opposing forces. The Christian concept of incarnation represented the union of divine and human natures. Buddhist philosophy emphasized the middle way between extreme asceticism and indulgence. Taoist wisdom celebrated the dynamic balance of yin and yang forces. These traditions offered practical methods for working with psychological opposites that contemporary psychology had largely ignored. But Jung's approach to integration was not religious in any conventional sense. It was based on empirical observation of how consciousness developed and transformed through direct engagement with psychological conflict. He documented countless cases of individuals who had achieved remarkable personal transformation through learning to hold opposing tensions rather than seeking premature resolution through one-sided identification. The therapeutic implications of this approach were revolutionary. Instead of trying to eliminate symptoms or conflicts, Jungian therapy sought to help people develop the psychological capacity to contain and work creatively with whatever arose in their experience. Depression and anxiety were not problems to be solved, but rather signals that some form of integration was needed between conscious attitudes and unconscious contents. Relationship difficulties often reflected the projection of internal conflicts onto external partners, rather than genuine incompatibility between people. By learning to recognize and integrate their own internal opposites, individuals could often resolve relationship problems that had seemed intractable when approached through external manipulation or compromise. Creative blocks frequently resulted from one-sided identification with either rational control or emotional spontaneity. Artists and writers who learned to balance conscious craft with unconscious inspiration often found that their work achieved depths and qualities that neither approach could produce independently. Jung's understanding of integration also applied to collective psychological problems that plagued modern society. Political polarization often reflected the projection of internal psychological splits onto external groups and ideologies. Rather than genuinely engaging with different perspectives, people tended to identify completely with one political position, while projecting all negative qualities onto the opposition. This dynamic created the psychological conditions for fanaticism, violence, and the breakdown of democratic dialogue. Communities that could learn to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously while working toward genuine synthesis might develop more effective approaches to social problems than those trapped in adversarial thinking. Economic systems that integrated individual achievement with collective welfare might prove more sustainable than those based purely on competition or cooperation. Educational approaches that balanced intellectual development with emotional and spiritual growth might produce more psychologically healthy and socially responsible citizens. But Jung was realistic about the challenges involved in achieving such integration. The human mind's natural tendency was towards simplification and one-sided identification, because psychological complexity required tremendous energy and emotional maturity to maintain. Most people, most of the time, would prefer clear answers and definite positions to the ambiguity and uncertainty that integration required. Moreover, integration was never a permanent achievement, but rather an ongoing process that needed to be renewed constantly as new life challenges arose. The person who had successfully integrated their shadow material might face new challenges around power and success. The individual who had balanced thinking and feeling might need to work on integrating sensation and intuition. Each stage of life presented new opportunities and requirements for psychological integration. Jung's personal journey exemplified both the possibilities and the difficulties of this lifelong work. His own psychological crisis and recovery demonstrated how confronting internal opposites could lead to creative breakthrough and expanded consciousness. His extensive self-analysis through dream work and active imagination showed how individual exploration could contribute to collective understanding. His professional development illustrated how personal transformation could enhance rather than compromise professional effectiveness. But Jung also acknowledged the costs and limitations of his approach to integration. The depth of psychological work he advocated was not suitable for everyone and required certain prerequisites of education, stability, and motivation that were not universally available. Some individuals might be better served by more supportive or directive approaches that did not demand such intensive self-exploration. Furthermore, the emphasis on individual development could not substitute for necessary changes in social, economic, and political structures that affected human welfare. Psychological integration was a crucial component of human flourishing, but not sufficient by itself to address all the challenges facing individuals and communities. Jung's legacy for contemporary consciousness lies not in any specific techniques or theories, but in his fundamental recognition that human wholeness emerges through conscious engagement with the full complexity of psychological experience. This insight remains as relevant today as it was a century ago, perhaps more so given the increasing polarization and fragmentation that characterize modern life. In our current historical moment, when traditional sources of meaning continue to erode while new forms of division and conflict emerge, Jung's vision of integration offers both individual hope and collective guidance. His work suggests that the path forward lies not in choosing sides or seeking simple solutions, but in developing the psychological capacity to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously while working towards synthesis that honors essential truth contained in apparent opposites. The individuals who can achieve such integration become what Jung called modern people, not because they embrace current fashions or technologies, but because they have developed forms of consciousness adequate to the complexity of contemporary life. They can appreciate scientific knowledge without losing touch with spiritual mystery. They can value individual freedom without abandoning community responsibility. They can engage with global culture while maintaining connection to local roots. These integrated individuals cannot solve the world's problems single-handedly, but they can serve as examples of what becomes possible when human consciousness embraces rather than flees from the full richness and complexity of existence. Their presence in families, organizations, and communities creates psychological conditions that support others' development toward greater wholeness and authenticity. Jung's ultimate message to humanity is both challenging and encouraging. Challenging because it demands that we give up comfortable simplicities and face the full difficulty of conscious living. Challenging because it requires taking responsibility for our psychological development rather than waiting for external solutions to internal problems. Challenging because it calls us to love and accept others while maintaining our own authentic boundaries and values. But encouraging because it demonstrates that human consciousness is capable of remarkable development and transformation. Encouraging because it shows that individual growth can contribute meaningfully to collective healing, even when larger social change seems impossible. Encouraging because it proves that meaning and purpose are available to anyone willing to undertake the journey towards psychological wholeness and spiritual maturity. The mind of Carl Gustav Jung contained wisdom that humanity is still learning to understand and apply. His insights into the depths of human consciousness continue to offer guidance for anyone seeking to live authentically in an increasingly complex and challenging world. His legacy challenges us to embrace the full mystery of human existence while maintaining hope for continued psychological and spiritual evolution. Those who choose to follow the path of integration that Jung mapped join a community of conscious individuals working toward greater human understanding and compassion. This is Jung's enduring gift, not a finished system of knowledge, but an ongoing invitation to explore the depths of consciousness and discover what becomes possible when we learn to hold the tension of opposites with wisdom, courage, and love. The journey toward wholeness continues, individual by individual, generation by generation, as humanity gradually awakens to the full depths and possibilities of conscious existence. In this great work, Jung's contributions remain as vital and transformative today as when he first began exploring the mysterious territories of the human soul.